Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. My name is Walter Hurd. I'm the director of the Army's Transition Assistance Program. I'm talking to you here from beautiful Fort Knox, Kentucky, our home base where we are located, our headquarters. Of course, the Transition Assistance Program is global, and we are located about anywhere soldiers are located, which is around the world. So I'm honored to talk with you today, and I appreciate your time and your interest. So we got a couple of things to talk about before we get going. First, again, what a great day and what an honor to talk about this subject. You know, this subject, helping soldiers transition, really has two areas of extreme importance. In no particular order, I'll say first, it helps the soldier who has signed a blank check to his or her country saying, put me in as you see fit. And as they transition off of active duty and go back to the civilian society from which we all came, by the way, this helps prepare them. And second, of equal importance, I might add, it helps industry, and ultimately it helps the American economic system by pumping in new blood, new skill sets, and new passions into your company, into your community, and into our economic system. So it's really a win-win situation around the world. So today I'm really talking to a couple of different audiences, and we typically kind of separate these audiences, but we've got them all here today, which is great. I'm talking to a lot of soldiers out there that are still in uniform, a lot that have still that have recently transitioned, but they're kind of going through that process. Talking to some spouses who are also either have a spouse still in uniform or has just recently transitioned. In some cases, maybe the veteran transitioned some time back. Also talking to military leaders, commanders, and senior non-commissioned officers who really support and control that system for their soldiers. And then, of course, I'm talking to industry leaders, be they small companies or large companies. My experience from talking to industry leaders all over is that they all share the number one limiting factor to grow their business, and that is the human capital. Typically, they have enough raw materials, certainly enough customers nowadays, but the challenge is to get the right human capital back into the workforce. That helps the workforce, certainly helps the individual. So really, my objective today is to share information. So if you have any questions, and I hope you do, or comments, please, at the end, we'll have a little Q&A time, and you can text them in your text box, or chat box, I guess, not text box. I know you know how to do that. So I look forward to those questions and discussion points here in a few minutes. All right, so let's get going on slide number 1. Happy birthday. The Army Transition Assistance Program started 30 years ago, almost exactly. So we're pretty excited about that. And like everything, it's matured a lot in 30 years. For really the first, 20 or so, a little bit more than half of that 30-year life cycle so far, it was basically a voluntary program that we encouraged soldiers to attend. And as you would expect, some did and some did not. Some were more successful, some were not. It's pretty simple. And then about 10 or 12 years ago, we changed the program to be more mandatory so that everybody must attend and meet certain gates. It wasn't differentiated by your goals or your education or your experience, but kind of everybody met the same gates. And then just a couple of years ago, we're pretty excited that those gates were segregated by capabilities and long-term goals. So it's more tailorable now than it was just a few years ago, and certainly several years ago. So we're very excited about where we are in this 30 years so far, and we look forward for another longer than 30-year period. If you look at the second bullet there, I want to point out just a couple of things, and you'll hear me say this often. First line there says that soldiers must begin this process a year prior to their actual transition date. This is key. What we found is that the earlier you begin the process of thinking about your transition and coming up with a plan, the better off you are. It's real simple. And I'm going to beat that drum, particularly for the spouses and soldiers and military leaders that are out there today. And we start off, as I mentioned, halfway through the second paragraph. It says a self-assessment. So what you need as you're transitioning might be different than what I need or different than what they need. So that way we can tailorize the program a little bit so we all get our different needs. Down there on the bottom, the last paragraph talks about something we're pretty excited about. The Army, and only the Army, has a 24/7 virtual center. Now, most of you are familiar probably with the TAP centers on your installation, the brick and mortar centers. You make an appointment, you go in and you see a counselor, which is great. And that's by far the most popular, and I would argue in many cases, the most effective way to go through TAP. But we also have a virtual center online, obviously, that allows you to do the same thing in a brick and mortar, but you can do it 24/7. And of course, you can do it from anywhere. You know, our Army is spread out worldwide. And while most of our soldiers are at installations, we've got tens of thousands that are teaching ROTC at a small university or recruiting in a small town somewhere. And they need and deserve the same transition assistance as their counterparts at the big installations. Just like industry leaders need access to that talent, just like they do need access to soldiers at larger installations. So not listed on this slide, but I'd like you to kind of think about this TAP process with two, what we call mission essential task list. So there are two things that we must do, all of us, to be successful, whether it's the program itself, whether it's the soldier or the civilian potential employer or the spouse. Two things. Number one, we must prepare the soldier. So in this presentation for the next few minutes, I'm going to break it down. First, talk about preparation of that soldier, teaching them and working and counseling them so they get a resume and a budget and an MOS gap analysis and that sort of thing. And number two is to connect that soldier with an employer, in most cases, back home. So they have to be prepared. They have to know what's going on, what they want to do. They have to have their resume and their plan, be prepared. And then second, they have to actually make that connection with an employer in most cases, or a school or some kind of training facility in other cases. As the name implies, mission essential. If they fail at either one of those two tasks, they're not prepared, but they are connected, or they are prepared, but they're not connected. If they fail at either one, then the whole thing doesn't happen very well. So let's kind of look at how that plays out from a perspective of the soldier over time. All soldiers, active, guard, reserve, young, old, basically have three phases in their uniform period. They have the beginning, the middle, and the end, just like any other phase of life, right? So as I said earlier, the key here is to begin this transition intellectual effort in your head early. I tell people transition assistance is like physical training in that you can't start too early. Wouldn't it be great, just think as a crazy example, if all of us started doing 40 or 50 push-ups every day at age 8? Boy, we'd be smooth for the rest of our life. In fact, we usually started doing that stuff later on in life. So transition assistance, similarly, you'll see on the left there, the initial phase in the first year of a soldier's training. There are some things that by regulation and policy, soldiers do. As they work on their MOSs, they get an understanding of parallel credentials that match up with those military occupational specialties. They register for the Veterans Administration benefits early on so they can think about that and know about that. And they work on their budget. Initially, they work on their budget while they're in uniform, how to budget their time while they're in uniform. And then ultimately that can then transition into a budget for lifelong expenses. And then finally, there on the bottom on the left, they develop their individual development plan. And that's how to develop for your military goals. But as you begin to think about it and talk about it, that developmental plan also can segue, it can grow into your long-term goals because nobody wears the uniform forever. at some point, young or old, they transition into some version of a civilian outfit. So they're in the middle, the service phase, and this is really a phase that the leaders and the soldiers, but I'll point out particularly the Army leaders can make some great headway on. These things happen in the service phase, whether that's a year or 2 or 20 or 30. It's still the bulk of your service in many cases. So up there on the upper left, we've got the annual review process. Like every other career, of course, there's a very deliberate evaluation process in our Army. And one of the things that the leader, the raider, is supposed to talk with the soldier who's getting evaluated during that process is, what are your goals? What are your strengths and weaknesses? Where do you see yourself in 2 or 3 years, and 5 or 10 years, or maybe in 20 or 30 years? And then as you have that conversation, you begin to set milestones on how to get from here to there. I'll admit and say too often we have that conversation only about your next military assignment. How do you move from being a squad leader to a platoon sergeant? And that's a good conversation. Absolutely needs to happen. But I think also the second part of that conversation is, okay, so after you've been a platoon sergeant or a first sergeant, where do you see yourself in 20 years or 25 or 30 years? Physically, financially, spiritually, with family, etc. Also in that service phase in the upper right, we see the careerist schools at about the 10-year mark. That's one of the few actual TAP additive requirements we put into the service phase. But what the Army's requiring, is that soldiers, before they go to that mid-career course, which is about the 10-year mark for the careerist, for the professional, they draft a resume, a civilian resume that they can then turn in and have reviewed when they get to that mid-career school, the staff college or intermediate learning educational environment, whatever it may be. Now, those soldiers at about that 10-year mark can work on that resume a couple ways. They can go to a TAP center, certainly, and say, I'm not transitioning yet, I'm going to school, but would you look at my resume? Love to do it. Come on down, please. Or frankly, they've been in the Army about 10 years. They can get online and they can just kind of stumble through it on their own, or some other services, but we're happy to do that. And what we're trying to do for those mid-career soldiers who are in 10, they're probably going to stay for another 10 because statistically that's what happens if you're in that long, is we're trying to educate them personally on how to think about the future, how to write out your goals and your capabilities on a piece of paper so that they will be ready, and also so that they can talk to their young soldiers. Because by and large, our system is built so that most soldiers serve a term or two, maybe 4 to 6 years, and then transition and go home. That's great. God bless them. That's how the system and the program is put together, so that now with this, their leaders have at least had some experience with writing a resume, which is not like looking for a job, and it's not like being a civilian, but at least it's their toe in the door. Over on the right, the transition phase, that's really what happens during TAP. You see up on top there on the right, it's 12 to 18 months prior to transition, which is the date on a Department of Defense form, DD form 214, which is the actual piece of paper that every soldier gets that says, on this date, you are no longer on active duty. So back up that date, 12 to 18 months, and they begin this process. Now, if they've worked on it or thought about it at least during the initial phase and the service phase, what we found is the transition phase is much smoother, and really the transition itself is much smoother because they've had multiple conversations with squad leaders and platoon sergeants and first sergeants and commanders with, this is my ultimate goal. It's to go back home and open up a mechanic shop, or it's to go to law school and set up my own firm, whatever that goal is. The only wrong answer is, I don't know. Or maybe I don't have any goals. That's the wrong answer. So these phases here, and I'll talk about them, these tasks on the right side, the transition phase. I'll talk about them in more detail here in a couple of slides, but Again, I want to stomp my foot, particularly to the soldiers and leaders in uniform, early and often. So let's go to the next slide and kind of talk about what early and often looks like. So here we have basically a generic timeline on the left, 18 months prior to your actual transition date on the far right, which is at zero, transition minus zero. So the law says that soldiers must begin this process no later than 12 months before the date on their DD 214. So if a soldier begins it, they walk in the door 11 and a half months, that soldier and that soldier's leadership and chain of command is in violation of U.S. code, which Department of Defense must report to Congress every year. But the real reason why you want to, while you as soldiers want to go early, and spouses why you want to go early, and leaders why you want to ensure they go early, the real reason is that statistically, soldiers who begin early are 2 times as likely to find employment at their right at the transition date than soldiers who begin kind of at the last minute, meaning in the last 6 or 8 months. So let me just say that again, twice as likely to find and accept a job if you start early on the left side of this timeline than you are if you start late on the right side. Now, I know for a fact you as military leaders and certainly soldiers, you want to support your soldiers being twice as likely to have that success. So that's reason number one. Reason number two, statistically, they're about 33% more likely to make more money if they start transition on the left side of this timeline, and about a third less likely to make money, as much money, if they start on the right side. So again, of course, the soldiers and the leaders want to facilitate making more money. So start on the left side. And the first thing you do up in the upper left-hand corner is that self-assessment and individualized initial counseling. So that's really when you sit down with a counselor, you answer some questions, and we figure out what you need versus what the other person needs or the other person needs, because it's all different. And then we've broken down these various tasks to try to get you what you need and not waste your time with other stuff and get somebody else what they need. And then we give a fairly standard pre-separation counseling, and think about that as a menu at a restaurant. You're probably not going to eat everything on the menu, but you want to look at everything on the menu to decide if you want beef or chicken or pasta or something else. So based on your self-assessment, you look at that menu and you and the counselor kind of pick out what's appropriate. And then the things under that, the Army Day, that's, as the name implies, takes about a day or a day and a half. And you really talk about your personal plans. You look at your MOS, your military occupational specialty, and then you do a crosswalk to what you want to do. Now, some of those MOS crosswalks, frankly, are real simple. I was at a TAP center not too long ago talking to one of the transitioning soldiers who had a very specific medical career in the Army and wanted to do the exact same thing as a civilian. So there was a minimal gap, just some kind of state licensing things she had to work through, but a pretty small step as opposed to other MOSs, perhaps who don't have a crosswalk, or, they don't have as short of a walk, or, as is the case, frankly, with most soldiers, they choose not to do the same thing as a civilian as they did in the military, which is fine. A lot of civilian soldiers said, this was great. I enjoyed it for my 3 years or 4 years or 6 years or 30 years, but I kind of want to do something new, which is okay. So they need to map that out. Where am I now and where do I want to go? And then map that out between the two. And then the financial planning there at the end as well. It kind of helps you from a financial perspective, figure out what lifestyle do I have today and what lifestyle do I want later and what do I need to do to maintain that lifestyle. Over the next several months, you see some things listed there. About the 12 to 9 or so months, we encourage soldiers to schedule during that period a one-day Department of Labor employment fundamentals. The vast majority of the soldiers, be they young or old, want to transition and move into gainful employment. Some number want to go to school full time. Some number want to work for themselves, but the vast majority want to gain employment working for somebody else. So the Department of Labor Fundamentals class really helps you kind of figure out how to do that, which in many cases soldiers have never done. Under about the 7-8 month mark, we have a Veterans Administration benefits one-day symposium, which is a great symposium. It's the #1 most popular thing that we have on here, by the way, because all soldiers want to know and need to know their benefits, because it's not real simple, and it's different kind of based on your time and some of your experiences, different levels of benefit. So we encourage that, and that's about the right time to do it. These are in sequence for a reason, and it's not just convenience, it's what you need to think about first. The continued military service around the 5 or 6 month mark for the active component only. Some of them, many of them, have a reserve component obligation. Many of them do not, but we encourage them to have that discussion with a counselor, reserve component counselor, and really see what the benefits and advantages are. They may be financial, they may be social. What we found is that a lot of soldiers, when they transition off of active duty, boy, they are done. I don't want any more of this stuff. I'm out of uniform. I'm gone. And then after some amount of time, maybe 6 months or a year, it's like, I kind of miss that camaraderie. So the reserve component continuation of service really gives them the opportunity to have one foot in both worlds. So it's something to think about. The career tracks there on the lower right side, around the 4, 5, or 6 month prior to transition, after the soldiers kind of identified their long-term goals and some milestones and the finances behind it, and they've looked at employment options. This is really when you spend a couple of days with some actual experts and counselors and talk about the 4 basic tracks. Employment, working for somebody else, that's the biggest, of course. Full-time student, being an entrepreneur, or working and learning a vocational trade. So you start thinking about that around the 6, 5, or 4 month mark. You can prepare yourself. And then also on the very bottom right, you see career skills program eligibility. I'm going to talk about that in more detail here in a couple of minutes. It's a great program. You have to go through the mental exercise to figure out where I am and where I want to be. And then at the last 6 months or so, you can really start putting some meat to that and get there. And then the capstone, as the name implies, that about 3 months before transition, that's kind of the final test. When you sit down with the counselor and they say, okay, so a year ago you talked about doing this, this, and this. It looks like you've been to the classes. You may want to spend a little more time and attention in this area right here and police up some things. So again, if you think about the transition assistance effort, like you would think about an athlete, preparing for a big event, a big game, or a big race, they don't just wait. Athletes don't just wait until a month or so before the race and then try to run 24/7 and do 500 miles in 2 or 3 days. What they do, the athletes that win, run 2 or 3 or 4 miles every day for a long time. So on race day, they are fine-tuned as opposed to broken down and exhausted. So that kind of sums up the bulk of the first mental task, which is to prepare the soldier. So the second mental task, as I said earlier, is to make that connection from the soldier to the employer and from the employer to the soldier. And I'll be honest with you, that's a little bit harder. The Army has been training and preparing soldiers for lots of things for a long time. We've kind of got that down. But connecting a soldier, soon to be a veteran, with an employer, in many cases back home, it's just harder because we don't always live back home. But let me talk to you about how we do that. So if you look at this little flow chart here, on the left, we've got soldiers, about 100,000 a year, by the way, 110,000 depending on the year. And they go through the transition assistance program that I just outlined, 18 to 12 months or so, and they figure out what they want to do and milestones to get there, and they start to look and resumes and interviews and that sort of thing. And then on the right, on the other end of this handshake deal, we've got employers who are looking for human talent. And many of you are on the line today, and I want to applaud you for coming here to look, because again, by sheer coincidence of our freedoms and our national security, we give back to civilian society about 100,000 young men and women, or old men and women, in many cases older, who are a little bit more educated than average, a little bit healthier than average, and a little bit cleaner than average. And we give those folks back to the American community to work, to teach, to preach, to do all the good things that we need. And this is how we're going to do it. Let me talk for just a split second about those soldiers. You all know probably that about 3/4 of the American youth today cannot join the Army, which is a frightening statistic, absolutely frightening. Typically because they dropped out of high school, or they don't meet physical requirements, mostly overweight, or they have some kind of a drug, substance abuse issue. So what that means is, when soldiers go through the military process and they're trained and they're tested and they're steeled, they already started off in the top, 25 to 30%, because they finish school, they're healthy, and they're clean. And then we train them and steel them for 3 to 30 to 40 years. And then we give them back. So it's a pretty good raw product before they even begin day one on the civilian sector. So we're pretty excited about that. So let me talk you through these 6 or so squares that helps connect the soldier on one side to the employer or educator on the other side. And again, there's about 6 ways that can happen. And I'll tell you, some ways are more fine-tuned currently than others. And I will tell you that some ways for your industry may be better than others. So just look at them and kind of pick and choose and see what works for you. Incidentally, another little historical, interesting data point: of those 100-ish thousand soldiers, about half to 2/3, depending on their rank and component, are going home. The other half or so, or 1/3 maybe, are going to either stay where the Army left them, where their last tour was, or maybe go somewhere else. But a huge number, half or a slight majority, are going home no matter what. So again, you may have joined the Army from Timbuktu and then transitioned from Fort Bragg, but you're going back to Timbuktu. Thus my statement: it's harder to make that connection back with an employer in Timbuktu. So let's talk about these 6 squares in the middle here that can kind of help us do that. So the first one, now I've got a separate chart for some of these. The first one, the Army recently partnered with a great company called recruitmilitary.com. And I'll show you a chart here in a minute on some of that. And they offer some great services, some job postings, and virtual hiring events. The second square there, is one of those hiring events, either a virtual hiring event or a face-to-face hiring event. I'll talk about that here in a couple of minutes. The career skills program in the middle square there, I'm going to talk about as well. But that basically allows the soldier, for the last up to 180 days while they're in uniform, which is huge when you think about the benefits involved with that, to basically not do any more Army stuff and focus entirely on learning a career skill, a specific civilian skill. And I'll talk about that in great detail. The reserve component maximization there in the middle as well. There might not be an Army installation back home in Timbuktu, but there is absolutely an Army National Guard or an Army Reserve unit or armory somewhere near there with soldiers. Regardless of the component, it says U.S. Army on their shirt. So they are there and they can help with that connection effort as well. The American Job Centers are partially funded by the state government, partially funded by the federal government, but each one of them, and there are about 2,700 scattered across our country, so basically one in every hometown. Each one of them has 1 or 2 people whose sole job is to help veterans find employers and help employers find veterans. And then finally, down there on the bottom, the Partnership for Youth Success Program, or PAYS, is undergoing some maturation right now. But the long and short of it is, industries can partner with the Army under PAYS and request interviews of soldiers when they transition. And then when soldiers transition, they can go to that list of PAYS partners and pick one where they want an interview. So it really streamlines the process, and it's a great no cost. All of these, by the way, are great, efficient ways to make that connection, whether you're going from soldier to employer or employer to soldier. That connection is what we're after. So let me go into a couple of these with a little more detail. On the left there, the recruitmilitary.com webpage, our employment portal that I mentioned on the previous slide. We've been in partnership with them for a little over a year. It's a great effort. What they've got, job postings, and I think in the several hundreds of thousands. They do virtual career fairs for those in transition and for veterans. So this allows us, if you can flash back in your brain to the previous chart, we tell industry on the right, and we tell soldiers on the left the same thing when they say, how do I find the other, the employer or the employee? And the answer we tell about 100,000 soldiers and as many industries as ask is, step one is to go to recruitmilitary.com. So if you're an industry looking for talent, look there. If you're a soldier looking for employment, look there. And that's a great moneymaker for all of us concerned. On the right, these hiring events, whether they're in most cases face-to-face at an installation, although we do some online as well, but the key to success there is to make that about a 3-month process. Now, before you fall out of your chair, I don't mean the hiring event itself is 3 months in the conference room somewhere. The event is probably 1 or 2 couple of days, but the process is 90 days. So in the first month or so of that 90 days, the soldier gets to look at all the companies listed in the hiring event. And the soldier says, yeah, that one, and that one are pretty interesting to me because I've already started thinking about transition and I'm determining where I want to go and what I want to do. So I like companies 1, 2, and 3. Then in the second month or so, the soldier can take their resume, they can customize them for companies A, B, and C, and careers and locations A, B, and C. And then they can submit those resumes. And then over the next month or so, the companies get a bunch of resumes and they pick candidates 1, 2, and 3 that make sense and schedule and maybe even conduct some phone calls or some virtual digital type of interviews. And then the hiring event is an actual hiring event where you shake hands, you do a face-to-face meeting and discussion. We've been looking at each other for a couple of months, resumes. I've researched your company. I've researched the hometown. I think this is a good match. Let's get down and talk turkey. So I said earlier, about 2/3, sometimes half, depending on the demographic, go home. So you'll hear this a couple of times. The key to these hiring events and some other things is to have a national view. If you're an installation and all the hiring events are for companies right outside of the gate or within a couple hours of the gate, you're probably not going to have a big return on investment because most soldiers aren't going to stay right outside the gate. They're going back home. So the successful hiring event has opportunities back home, which means maybe national firms or something more spread out. And I'll make the same argument with the next slide, which talks about the career skills program, which is one of those squares on the left to right slide that we looked at earlier. So the career skills program is allowed by Congress starting about 2 years ago. And it says that basically commanders may authorize soldiers to attend while on active duty during the last 180 days of their active duty. They may allow them to attend certain civilian training things like apprenticeships, internships, on the job, and more generic employment skills training. And I'll talk about those in more detail here in a couple of minutes, but a couple of phrases there. Commanders may allow soldiers to attend this kind of training. The preparation piece that I talked about at the beginning, not the connection piece that we're talking about now, but the preparation piece, commanders must ensure soldiers do that. They may allow soldiers to do the career skills program. So this comes with a pretty significant, frankly, price tag for the Army, because the Army pays all their wages and benefits, but they're doing civilian skills training for another career entirely. Certainly no other industry does that, I'm quite certain. And certainly not for the length of time that we do it here, which in many cases is weeks and months, and in some cases it's several months. So on the left there, you see the second bullet. I want to point that out. The focus clearly for the career skills program is and must always remain the younger first-term enlisted soldier, somebody who really needs to fine-tune their skills or create new skills and get that civilian job that they're really excited about. The more senior retiring person ideally has figured a couple of things out over the last 20 years, but that young 18, 24-ish year old soldier probably graduated high school, went to basic, did a tour 3 or 4 years at Fort somewhere, and now they're going back home. So that's really the aim of this. And I'll tell you the third bullet, as it says, it's different from post to post, and that's okay. Big posts with a certain demographic, maybe young soldiers, have various types of career skills programs there. Smaller posts, maybe with a demographic of older, more senior soldiers, have a different kind of career skills program there. Soldiers, as it implies there on the lower left, or states on the lower left, can go what we used to call permissive temporary duty. It's now called administrative absence. But basically, if I'm at Fort Knox, Kentucky as a soldier, but there's a great career skills program at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, that's got my perfect dream job right there, well, the Army may, not must, may allow me to go there and without being AWOL or anything like that, and attend that career skills program. On the right there, you see the Army leader's role. The battalion commander is the approver for a soldier's participation. They say, this is your place of duty for a certain period of time. Don't come to the office. Don't come to the motor pool. Don't come to PT formations. Your place of duty is to go to the career skills program that we've discussed. And these career skills programs, by the way, have about a 95% job placement rate. That's huge. That's an A on any grading scale you want to look at. So it's important that you send soldiers, for the leaders out there, it's important that you send soldiers that are truly excited about this career skill, whatever it is, plumbing, electrician, you name it. It's not just a couple of weeks to get out of the motor pool. And that's why we have such a high application rate. Similarly, for the employers listening, it's important that you keep that job offer rate pretty high. And frankly, we look at that. We had a few employers who said, I've got 10 job openings. I'd like to have a career skills program with about 20 people in it, and then we'll pick the best 10. And the Army said, no. If you have 10 openings, we'll give you 10 soldiers, and they'll be good soldiers, and hire the best ones, certainly, but we're not going to give you 20. So again, the battalion commander looks at that. They talk to the soldier, because this is done early and often. Okay, so they have this discussion at reenlistment and annual evaluations, and then certainly in the 18 or so months before the transition. And then that's the soldier's job. Now, the commander is still responsible for that soldier. If the soldier's injured or gets into trouble or anything else, they're still under the command of the commander and the leaders, and they need to remember that. In an emergency, If we go to war, or I shouldn't say if, the next time we go to war, which hopefully will be a while, commanders can pull their soldiers out of that training. First and foremost, the job of our Army is to support and defend our Constitution, and we do that with soldiers. So commanders certainly are very involved with all aspects of TAP, to include supporting the go early, go often piece. The number one concern and complaint across all of TAP is, by the way, this is a great program, but my leaders don't give me the time to go. So speaking of time, let me get on to the next slide here. I'll talk about the career skills programs and really what these are, and they're pretty self-explanatory. Obviously, the internship is having a soldier work on site for a company. The company doesn't pay them, and they can work them 40 hours a week to actually learn their job, and the company learns that potential employee. The pre-apprenticeship program, as that name implies, includes OJT and some formal classroom, testing, evaluation kind of thing to ultimately go through the apprenticeship, journeyman, and master process. But again, it's a great way to get the foot in the door. And then down there on the third one, on-the-job training, as the name implies, is simply training. There's not any formal testing. It's real-world stuff. It's what I got as a high school kid digging ditches. I got on-the-job training. This is a shovel. That's the ground. Do like me. And eventually I figured it out. And then the employment skills program, as the name implies, much more generic, broader, et cetera. So I'll just show you a map. And I know this is an eye chart and you can't read it, but that's not the point. The point is we've had about 2,000 career skills efforts all across the world, all across mostly America, a few in Europe and Asia, some better than others. And we look and evaluate each one after its first iteration before it gets a second iteration. Extremely high success rate, about 95% employed. So the reason the Army invests the time and energy to pay soldiers to be soldiers, yet have them partner with industry to learn a skill, is because we get a huge return on investment. 95% of them move on to a job in that career skills field. So that's great news. Incidentally, there are, of course, a couple of strings attached. There are some rules that Congress put on us with this, and one of them is that soldiers cannot pay for this training. The second one is that the Army cannot pay for this training. The Army is paying the soldier's salary, and the soldier is paying with his or her time and effort. So what that means is the employer, or in many cases, maybe a union or a program, will pay for that training. And it's pretty exciting. I want to point out just a couple on this map that you can't see, but I'll point out what a good one looks like. And I'll just pick one of my favorites at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, the pharmacy company called CVS. And if you're not familiar with it, go down to the nearest intersection in your hometown, and there's probably one there. They set up a career skills program at Fort Bragg that has, I think, about 25 or 30 soldiers, per iteration. I think it takes about a month or maybe 6 weeks. And basically on Fort Bragg, they set up a CVS pharmacy store. Fort Bragg can legally, and did in fact, loan them an old empty barracks room. So we're not paying any money, but we gave them the keys to an old building. They set it up to look like a CVS store. So when the soldiers go through the program, they learn how to do things that store managers learn how to do, like stock the shelves, do the time cards for the employees, do the cash register receipts at the end of the day, and all those things. So the soldier then can go back home upon transition with a piece of paper from CVS National Headquarters and give that to the CVS local pharmacy and say, let's talk turkey because I know how to do what you need done. So really, there's about 4 or so keys to success with the whole career skills program. One, shorter is better. About a month or maybe 2 is the ideal length of time for one of these programs. If you get into 4 or 5 months, That's a long time away from work for the soldier. So from a leader's perspective, Army leader's perspective, I can help one person for 6 months through a career skills program, or I can help 6 people for 6 different 1-month programs. So which one do you want to help, commanders? You want to help 6 or you want to help 1? Redundant question, I know. The second key to success for a career skills program and the hiring event, as I mentioned, was national. Most of these soldiers are going home. You pick a location on this map where a soldier might transition, and most of them are not going to stay there. They're going to go home. So the career skills program and the hiring events don't need to all be local. Some of them, absolutely. But it can't all be the local police department, the local industry, et cetera. And then finally, the successful career skills program focuses on the younger, more junior soldier, particularly on installations that are predominantly younger and junior soldiers. Some installations, let's just say Fort Leavenworth, for example, which has a lot of military academics and staff college instructors, where the average age of transitioning soldiers is much higher, then those career skills programs might want to be different than someplace like Fort Bragg or Fort Hood or Joint Base Lewis McChord, where the bulk of the soldiers are young first-term soldiers. So let me shift gears here very quickly before we ask for questions here in just a couple of minutes. You know, the Army's about people. Certainly the soldiers and leaders know that, and I hope the industry knows that as well. We have things, but we're about people. And those people include the family of soldiers, the spouses. In fact, the saying in the Army is that you enlist the soldier, but you re-enlist the family member. So we do, in fact, care and support a lot about our family members. So a couple of notes about military spouses. First, all spouses, please go through TAP with your soldier. Everything on the 18-month chart that I showed you a few minutes ago, we encourage you to attend with your soldier. The Department of Labor workshops, Veterans Administration benefits workshops, the in-brief, you name it, please attend, because you're a team. And your soldier is going to want to talk about those topics. Where do we want to move? What do we want to do? What should we do? And that needs to be an informed discussion that both of you have. Just a couple of assets, I guess, is the phrase for the spouse employment perspective. One there on the left, the TEAMS program. It's a great program, and check them out if your soldier is transitioning or retiring or relocating from Fort number 1 to Fort number 2, which everybody does if you stay in more than just a couple of years. And then on the right, and I think most spouses are familiar with this, Military One Source has a lot of capabilities unique to all the many, many challenges of a military life. And I spent my entire adult life, by the way, either in uniform for 25 years or now supporting those in uniform for the last dozen or so. So very unique capabilities. So let me finish like I started a few moments ago. It's an honor to talk to each of you, and I really do appreciate that. I appreciate your interest and your focus in helping our country at this phase. And we're helping our country with two ways. One, we're helping the soldier get to the next chapter in their life. And two, we're helping industry, our industry, the industry that funds the whole economic engine behind democracy. We're helping that industry plug into the number one limiting factor in their growth, which is human capital. So what I'd like to do is take a break here. I'm going to have a drink of water, and I hope you all will chat some questions. I'll ask Jordana to come back online and help facilitate some of those chat boxes so I can see your questions.
All right. Thank you so much for that presentation. That's amazing. We do have a few questions already in the chat. And guys, if you've got more, definitely throw those in the Q&A portion over on your right. The first question looks like, can soldiers use TAP if they were on National Guard active duty Title 10 status for over 2 years? Or is the TAP only for Army Guard Reserve soldiers?
Yeah, that's a great question. So TAP by congressional mandate is for anybody as they transition off of Title 10 order. So if you're a regular Army soldier, if you're a mobilized active or reserve soldier, as long as you're under federal orders for 6 months, TAP is for you. Great question.
I have another question. It is from Bragg Berthold, who was one of our other speakers at the summit. Mr. Hurd, I would love to connect with you about ways I can support TAP classes long term. What is the best way for us to connect with you?
Well, by all means, reach out to the email address right here on the screen, and I'd love to chat with you. Anybody who can help complement this program, and if I can't help you, then I'll put you in touch with somebody who can.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
And it looks like that's all the questions. Did anybody else have any other questions? I've got one actually for you. I was wondering what you see, and you kind of addressed this a little bit before, but what is the biggest challenge for people getting out, for servicemen and women who are getting out? What do you see on your end as the biggest challenge for them?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you, Jordana. So for soldiers transitioning off of active duty, which is different from soldiers getting out. So many of the soldiers transition off of active duty and continue to serve in the Guard or Reserve. Okay, so they're not quitting the Army. They're simply changing from an active status to a part-time status. Mm-hmm. Or in my case, for example, many either ETS or retire. So I think the number one challenge, and I may have mentioned this earlier, it's that concept of beginning the process early. You know, soldiers are type A, hard charging, make it happen people. That's why America is victorious. And we got to translate that not just to our military combat roles, but to transitioning roles as well. And the earlier you begin this thought process, the earlier you wrap your head around what do I want to do and where do I want to do it, the better off you'll be. I'll give you a little longer answer perhaps than you're hoping for, but there are 3 questions for every transitioning soldier that will drive the rest of your life. So you don't have to answer these questions immediately, but you should all prioritize them as soon as you can. And the 3 questions are, where do I want to live? What do I want to do? And how much money do I need to make? One of those 3 questions is more important than the other 2. So figure out which one is most important and then answer it. And then that'll help you begin this whole process of transitioning and thinking about it and planning for it and setting out milestones and making those connections, be they back home or in a career field or in a price range, and then following through and being successful. So that going early piece facilitates all that. It's almost impossible to start on Friday and have it all, start on Monday and have it all figured out by Friday. So I appreciate great questions. If you have any more, please send them. I'd look forward to answering anybody. And I appreciate you, Jordana, for facilitating this thing. And I've had a great day.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. We appreciate you being here. We've got another session coming up, but thank you, sir, for showing up today and spending your time with us.
My pleasure. Thank you all.